The tribute to Lawrence Ferlinghetti will be read by Bill Morgan.
For nearly 102 years, Lawrence Ferlinghetti's life was filled with accidental happenstance. If at any point chance had led him to turn in another direction, we wouldn't be here paying tribute to him today. Of course, everyone's life is governed by chance, but none more so than Lawrence's. If I hadn't written to him from college back in the 1960s with schoolboy questions, he would never have invited me to San Francisco to meet him and interview him in person. We would never have become friends. A very minor if for him, but something that influenced my career and brings me here today. Ferlinghetti had major ifs of his own. If his father hadn't died before Lawrence was born in 1919, and if his mother hadn't been sent to an asylum after giving birth to Lawrence, he might have had a typical childhood. Then he wouldn't have been taken as a baby to France by a well-meaning aunt, wouldn't have returned with her at the age of 6, and wouldn't have been abandoned by her at the age of 9 when she left the employ of a wealthy Bronxville family. If that family hadn't acted as guardians, Lawrence never would have been educated at the Riverdale Country School or Mount Hermon Prep School or the universities of North Carolina and Columbia. If he hadn't enlisted in the Navy a few days before Pearl Harbor, he wouldn't have been in command of a subchaser on D-Day or been detailed to Japan at the end of the war. He would not have seen firsthand the total destruction of Nagasaki a few weeks later. That experience turned him from a warrior into a pacifist in an instant. There would have been no GI benefits to pay for his doctorate from the Sorbonne, where he fell in love with poetry and painting. But none of that would have brought him to membership in this august academy. It happened because chance led him to walk up Columbus Avenue in San Francisco one day in 1953, after he finished painting in his studio, instead of taking his usual route home. And along the way, he stopped to talk to a man who was putting up a sign at number 261. The sign read, "City Lights Books," and the man was Peter Martin, who had decided to open the first all-paperback bookshop in America. The name City Lights appealed to Lawrence, whose favorite film was Charlie Chaplin's classic City Lights. Ferlinghetti always saw a lot of himself in Chaplin's character of the little tramp. Lawrence became Martin's partner for a short time until Martin returned to New York City to found the New Yorker bookshop. Following the tradition of French bookstores that often published books as well as sold them, Lawrence printed and bound his books, which he called the Pocket Poets series. Not surprisingly, his first publication was his own collection of poems called Pictures of the Gone World. And this was followed by small editions of Kenneth Rexroth and Kenneth Patchen's poetry. And this might be the right time to reintroduce the word if into the narrative, because if this was all that happened, few people would have taken notice of Lawrence Ferlinghetti. However, one day in 1955, a goofy-looking kid from Paterson, New Jersey, walked into the bookstore with a sheaf of poetry under his arm, and he invited Lawrence to come to a poetry reading he and his friends were giving in a gallery on the other side of town. If Lawrence hadn't decided to go, we probably never would have heard anything about the Beat Generation. The young poet, of course, was Allen Ginsberg, and that night the Sixth Gallery reading became legendary. Allen read his poem Howl for the first time that evening, and that prompted Ferlinghetti to dash off a telegram, borrowing Emerson's famous line to Walt Whitman upon reading Leaves of Grass, "I greet you at the beginning of a great career," to which Lawrence added his own postscript, "When do I get the manuscript?" He printed a few hundred copies of the small book and stitched it himself and put it in the window of City Lights, and that would have been the end of it. but someone must have complained because the police came to the shop and arrested Ferlinghetti and his bookstore manager, Shig Morrell. Imagine being arrested for selling poetry, Shig would say later. If the ACLU hadn't come to the rescue to defend Lawrence, he probably just would have paid the fine and that would have been the end of it. But they did bring it to trial, and people like Rex Roth and Walter Van Tilburg Clark testified on behalf of the poem. As a result, the case received national attention and was ruled to be not obscene by a very conservative judge, saying that it did have some redeeming social value. And it might have ended right there if the Viking press hadn't been sitting on the fence about the publication of Jack Kerouac's book, On the Road. They saw the opportunity to get in on the beat publicity, and so they released the book. And one more if. If the regular New York Times book reviewer hadn't been away on vacation, the Times probably would have panned On the Road. But a substitute reviewer, Gilbert Milstein, gave it a rave and made On the Road a bestseller, putting the Beat generation on the literary map for good. Ferlinghetti issued volume after volume of poetry, making his City Lights imprint one of the leaders in avant-garde writing, and his bookstore became a mecca for a new generation of poets, as it remains today. His own poetry reached people worldwide, and his collection, A Coney Island of the Mind, sold well over 1 million copies. Still today, that inexpensive paperback introduces countless young readers to poetry. And he even had a beatnik Muppet named in his honor, Ferlinghetti Donizetti. At times, he was painfully shy, yet somehow he had the ability to captivate an audience at his readings. He felt more comfortable behind a mask and liked to call himself a gadfly who spoke out for the little Charlie Chaplin tramp in all of us. Of himself, he wrote in the third person singular, "He wants to scatter poems from airplanes across the landscape. He's some kind of poetic nut. Like he thinks he's Dylan Thomas and Bob Dylan rolled together with Charlie Chaplin thrown in. He wants to lip read everybody's thoughts and feelings and longings. He's a dangerous nut. He's got to be insane. He's got to be mad. He's so glad to be alive. He's real strange." I salute his memory.